Do it, motherfucker. Do it.
Okay, get rid of all the fucking timestamps and shit. Public, use politics. No, it's not made for kids. And I think...
Not made for kids.
Not made for kids. Well, I would imagine... Well, like, I talking about fascism and all the weird political shenanigans we've been getting ourselves into probably isn't, a kid's thing. But I always put not made for kids.
Fascism for kids.
Yeah, you gotta get them young, you know?
Hitler Youth.
Okay, I think so.
All right.
We're live. At the very least on my end, I got my video going and shit. And I think we're actually good to go. We're actually going now. So anybody watching, there's nobody watching right now, but if anybody does end up watching this part, we had a lot of fucking trouble getting Discord to just do its thing. So, but we're here now. Anyway, I'm talking.
Yay.
I'm clearly talking with Forever Dirt, another YouTuber. Along the lines of like political stuff and whatnot. Tell me more about yourself. Because I scanned your videos a little bit. I did watch the fascism one. I watched I think the first like 20 minutes or so while I was waiting for Zero Gold. And I would definitely like to know more of your thoughts on that. But
yeah, well, I have a YouTube channel where I mostly talk about Marilyn Manson and fascism, I guess. That's kind of where I've pigeonholed myself. But I'm very interested in politics, and I'm mostly interested in the sort of meta conversation about how we engage in politics, how we conduct discourse. That's really where my interest lies. And fascism proved to be an interesting topic for that because... as many people have pointed out, including George Orwell, everybody is a fascist to some person. He noted that he heard people from every different corner of politics get labeled fascists, to the point where the term kind of loses any meaning. And so that's where I started to get interested in it. I started to think, well, what actually are we talking about when we talk about fascism? Because the way it's generally discussed, it's basically that fascism means anything that we don't like. And so fascism is the great boogeyman. Fascism is the great enemy, no matter who you are in what part of the political spectrum. But what's interesting, what interested me is that I found in studying fascism, there was quite a lot in there that I could relate to. There was quite a lot in there that interested me genuinely as philosophy. And so I started to explore it more from a sympathetic angle of trying to understand it the way a fascist would understand their own ideology. And I came to some interesting conclusions. And so that recent video I made about fascism, why I admire fascism, is really the culmination of that journey of me kind of accepting the fact that I do have some things in common with fascism. There are other things I don't have in common with them. But wanting to then explore and open up that dialogue around the subject.
Okay. I would, a couple things on that. First off, I definitely agree. The majority of the time that someone calls somebody else a fascist, they're literally just using it as a, like, it's a way to say that's a bad person, right? It's kind of meaningless overall, yes. Or at least it's lost its original meaning. I can definitely see where you're coming from. And I would also say that given the opportunity, most people would probably go towards some sort of fascist, ways of doing things, right? Like, I mean, if you could have total power, or do things in a way where you are there's very little in your way. I could see a lot of people jumping on that. Well, I guess I should explain what I think when I hear the word like fascist. I typically think of a fascist nation is one that's very authoritarian, that's usually run by just one guy, a dictator. And that typically there's no sort of obviously authoritarian dictatorship, no sort of democracy there. Oh God, Sorry, my brain just blinked after that. So yeah, I guess here I'll start with that. That's fine. Just an authoritarian state with a dictator at the helm. Like that's usually what I think of when I think like fascist. So like
Yeah, and really the essence of fascism comes down to the idea of the state as the kind of supreme body of society and the thing around which everything in society coagulates. And so you're very right that fascism is probably the most essentially authoritarian political ideology there is. And I would say it's probably also maybe not the most essentially collectivist ideology, but one of the most essentially collectivist ideologies out there, because it conceives.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say the collectivist aspect. That's an interesting way to put it, especially since, well, I feel like there's a lot of talk about like the individual when it comes to like fascist speech, but there's not really. Now that I think about it, sorry, go ahead, keep going.
Right. Well, the whole conception of society under fascism is that society is not a collection of individuals, but rather a whole. The nation is a unified whole in which every individual is basically a cell playing a part in this big macro organism structure. And so really all life in fascism is centered around the central concept of the state. And that is what the philosopher of fascism, Giovanni Gentile, meant when he called fascism totalitarian. He didn't invent the word totalitarian, but he adopted it. It was originally invented by critics of authoritarianism, and it means basically what it means generally today in modern parlance. But when Gentile looked at that word, he said, yes, fascism is totalitarian, and that it is a totalizing of all of the forces of life in the nation with the state. And so the state is identified entirely with the nation and vice versa. They don't exist without each other.
Okay, yeah, that is definitely a bit different from how I usually feel, but yeah, I guess that makes sense. It's the most like it's the most because you could say that every nation functions like that to an extent, right? But there like most nations allow for a little bit more like individual freedom. Whereas in a like fascist state, it's more like everything you do is for the good of the nation. So yeah, I can see where you come from with that. So like, what would you say like the positive aspects then are, the ones that you said you can relate to?
Right. So I like the fascist conception of duty. And this is something that I was able to trace back to Giuseppe Mazzini, who was pretty much the founder of the nation of Italy. He was the leader of the organization Young Italy, which spearheaded the movement to unite Italy into one country. And he was not a right winger. He was more of a socialist, but he was a Republican who he was skeptical of the idea of the rights of man as expressed in the French Revolution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and all that, the liberal tradition, because he felt that focusing only on what we are owed as individuals then kind of warps our perspective. And so he wanted to move people into thinking more, orienting their minds toward understanding their duty to the rest of society as foremost. And that's something that fascism carried to the extreme. And I think that is a really remarkable and important and not often enough stressed aspect of political philosophy. The idea of an individual's duty to the rest of society. And I think it's a very wholesome thing, and it can backfire in some negative ways. But to me, that is a core essential idea that fascism, I think, understood that a lot of the more kind of individualist philosophies of the third estate, as I call them, kind of the liberal French Revolution socialist stuff, don't stress enough to my liking.
Okay, so I think that's where I start to run into like some disagreements with you. So I would say the whole reason we have like we work together to cooperate as a society to like try to maximize our own good to an extent, right? And in order to participate in that society, we have to give up certain freedoms. But like fascism's like kind of like what you were saying. It's like the extreme extent of that, where you almost give up like all of yourself in order for the greater good to be, or in order to pursue the greater good with the nation. I think at that point, it's not really worth it as an individual to participate in that society. Can you kind of see where I'm coming from?
I can totally see where you're coming from. And I would agree that fascism has in the past been far too cavalier about the question of individual liberty. And in fact, this is a criticism that even fascist leaders have offered. Specifically, the leader I'm talking about is Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists. And this is a clip that I actually used in that video of mine. It's him on firing line with William F. Buckley saying the basic error of fascism was the disregard for liberty. In the drive for action at all costs, it overrode individual liberty. And so he was saying this in the 1970s, that the great challenge of our time is to learn how to synthesize the drive for action, which was an important part of fascism that drove him into fascism, with the preservation of individual liberty. So I would agree that fascism has been too cavalier about disregarding the liberty of the individual. And I think it would be best if we are to kind of maybe bring a slightly more fascistic value back into society, into politics in the 21st century, to never lose sight of that, and to then understand the liberty of the individual as important for maintaining the overall health of the collective.
So I would argue, as society stands, we've more or less, at least once again, just my opinion, we've more or less settled on a really nice balance between individual freedom and like what you owe to the nation. Like essentially just like paying your taxes and like being good to the like strangers on the street and stuff. I don't know how much more, and I guess like during really fucked times, like obviously if we get into another world war, there's going to have to be some sort of like, there'll probably have to be some sort of draft or something like that. Those are certain things. Like I don't know if, outside of like helping to maintain like what we've built through like taxes and like protecting our country if we have to. I'm not sure how much else I would agree that like the individual owes the nation, I guess, if that makes sense. It's just like I feel like we should try to maximize that like the ability to like go for those freedoms, or like the ability to be free while like trying to like I get people to help out as much as it seems like they need to. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think a lot of it is psychological, and a lot of it is kind of assumed inherited values that we have. And so in this country, we have a strong tradition of people being anti-government, no matter where you look. It seems that people are always very skeptical of state power in whichever direction they are, and they can have very wildly contradictory conclusions based on this. But virtually nobody is repping the idea of authoritarian government and of the power of the state. Virtually nobody kind of fetishizes that idea in our society, and it's very common to hear people kind of conflate liberty with goodness, and freedom, if it's more free, then it's more gooder. And I think that to a certain extent, I think that's healthy. But I also think that it encourages us to kind of think in a way where we're not looking at what we can do for the rest of the world, and we're looking at what the rest of the world is threatening to take away from us, what the rest of the world is threatening to do to us. And there's this kind of closed off, fortified attitude that comes about from that. And I think it would be healthy for us to be able to open up a little bit and to be able to. Yes, go on. Interrupt me.
I'm sorry. It's just on that. What's like instead of us focusing on what's good for the world, focusing you're saying that through like fascism we could do that more. We could focus on the good of humanity overall. As far as I'm concerned, it seems like fascism has always been a really, really nationalistic sort of ideology that like strictly focuses on their people and their nation at the expense of like everybody. Is that?
Yes, you're very right about that. And that's one way that fascism differs from Mazzini's thought, because he wanted to extend the goodwill beyond the nation into the whole world. The fascists more or less stopped right at the nation. And I kind of, have mixed thoughts on the whole question of nationalism versus internationalism. But I will say that I am rather sympathetic to the nationalist position, only in that nationalism, what it says is that we can only help the people we can help. We can only really do what we can do with the powers that we're granted in the border that we are assigned. And so trying to organize an international community to cooperate together is a very noble goal, and I do support that. But I think that nationalism kind of recognizes the limits of international cooperation, and it says there's only so much you can do with all these competing interests trying to compromise between them. And at the end of the day, you kind of have to take care of your own people.
But yeah, and I would agree. I would also argue that nations working in their own best interests most of the time, especially since our economies are all super interconnected nowadays. It seems like when a country's acting in its own good, it typically benefits everybody else. Not always, of course. There are like wars and like people like screwing each other over, like when it comes to like market stuff. But like it seems like overall, it's kind of like I'm trying to think of a specific thing that's just not coming to mind at the moment. It's almost that idea of, oh my God, you know BioShock, right? You know that video game?
I am aware of it, but I've never played it.
Okay, so there's the guy that founded that like underwater city or whatever. He was like a full-on like a libertarian, right? Like no government, every man should just like essentially. His argument was if every man pulls his side of the chain, focuses on what benefits him, and if everybody's doing that, then overall the nation will prosper. That was sort of like the idea. I guess that's sort of the idea I'm trying to go for. It seems like, yeah, when nations are working in their own best interest, it seems to be good overall for the world, at least like how things work nowadays. It seems to be that way. So I was curious when it comes to, so I guess in what ways do you think it would be beneficial for, like, let's say America to be more of a fascist nation?
Well, one thing about me is that I am a proponent, or I sympathize, I guess, with what Thomas Sowell calls the do something approach to economics. And so I like the idea of the government getting really hands-on with the economy and experimenting with approaches to try to alleviate some of the ills that are created by just the problems inherent with the market. And that is a huge part of some forms of fascism, specifically the area of fascism. Yes.
So on that, well, it seems like most nations, or at least like most capitalist nations, like we've discovered through time that like letting the market just do its own thing just doesn't seem to work well for a lot of people. So the government typically steps in a lot of cases. That's why I'm actually going to talk to some sort of teacher, I think. And I said that I'm for like a highly regulated like capitalist sort of like economy. Apparently that was interesting to him. But anyways, like I would say that's that's already like a feature. That's not necessarily like a fascist feature, at least not in my mind. Like we can do that with a more democratic, or I guess republic, sort of like governmental setup. You know what I mean?
Yes, and you're right about that. But I do think that we are kind of limited in our ability to act decisively and quickly for the economy. And I think that we're limited in our ability to act quickly and decisively in all respects due to the slow and difficult process of democracy, of representative democracy. And I am in favor of democracy, but I do wonder if there are ways we can maybe streamline the system so that we can elect governments that actually have the power to act more decisively. And that might not always be a good thing. Sometimes the man of action, if you Mosley actually used a very good metaphor. If you have like some big heavy pallet that needs to be pulled, you can strap it to an ox and the ox can pull it. But you got to be careful that the ox doesn't go crazy and fucking everything up. And so that's kind of the problem with the idea of the man of action. And that's kind of the problem with the idea of, an authoritarian government, the government that has the freedom to act without getting checked. And so I do think there's a balance that needs to be struck. And I am not entirely, I'm not entirely certain what the right approach is for how we should set up government and how we should treat government. But I do think that these ideas are worth considering and bringing back into the conversation.
Well, just to touch on the how fast can our government act? First off, as far as I understand, having a slow government is almost like a feature, because if you're making a ton of quick changes all at once, it can really fuck things up, like really bad. Or you could just like swing from one extreme to the other without like any sort of checks at all. And secondly, when it comes to like really fast, like quick decision making, that's why the president has like, certain powers that he can do like unilaterally, right? Like when it comes to executive orders, or I'm pretty sure he can send the military to wherever the fuck he wants without informing Congress for like 30 days, stuff like that. Like that's why we have that one man in the Oval Office, right? It's so that when the time comes for quick decisions, there is somebody that can make those quick decisions without having to go through a gigantic process, right? So I would argue we already have I would say we have a nice balance between when it comes to Congress, it being somewhat difficult and slow, but that helps keep us on an even keel. But then having somebody that can like push the big red button when bad things start to happen, right? Like, does that make sense?
Yes, it makes perfect sense. And I think that the system that we already have is quite remarkable in a lot of ways. And I really do appreciate the fact that we have a system like this, as opposed to many, many other countries in the world that have much more dysfunctional governments. And so I think overall, in the grand scheme of things, when you look at our country versus all the other countries, and where we came from and where we're heading, we're generally on the right track. But I do also think that there are, valid concerns that the fascists brought up, and they had valid motivations in pursuing what they were pursuing at the time. And specifically in regards to Mosley and the British Union of Fascists, they had a lot of urgent problems that they wanted to address. And it was very difficult for them to get anything done at that time with that kind of government, that kind of zeitgeist that they had in politics. And so I sympathize, I think, with both sides. I sympathize with where you're coming from. I also sympathize with where they were coming from.
So I'm trying to... here's an interesting question. Do you consider Trump to be a little bit more on the fascist side of things?
Definitely, I think that Trump
Oh, by the way, I'm listening. I'm just I don't like vaping
is
on stream, so I'm gonna turn off my camera when I do. I just think it's tacky when I do it, but I'm listening whenever I turn off my camera. I'm listening still, just so yeah.
okay. Okay. Yeah, I definitely think that Trump has a more fascistic quality to the overall phenomenon of his fan base and his form of politics. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Trump is a fascist because I think there's a lot that he doesn't have in common with fascism just on a fundamental level.
Well, I would say the fact that
And
he's not a
I
dictator
think
yet.
more often than not,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, well, I think more often than not, when people talk about Trump in relation to fascism, what they're pointing out is that Trump electrifies a certain kind of anti-democratic urge in a far-right sector of the Republican voting base. And that definitely is a fascistic quality. But I don't think that Trump really philosophically has anything in common with fascism. And I think that his sort of anti-democratic qualities are more just out of convenience than anything else, out of self-aggrandizement than anything else.
Well, but it's still like a problem. I would say it's not just far right people in the Republican Party. At least, I mean, he got elected, so like a lot of people had to have been backing him, and it seems like he still has a huge amount of support, even after January 6th, which is mind blowing. But so when I look at Trump, it makes me like it makes me just not want to fuck with fascism like ever. It seems to like hardcore radicalize people. Well, and also another like attribute of fascism I didn't bring up. Well, it's because it's just coming to mind. Well, I guess I'll pose it as a question. Do you think that all like fascism, like fascism, has to incorporate some sort of like this is the ideal citizen, and we need to like strive to make this kind of like maybe not as extreme as the Nazis went, but like something down that same path?
Yes, I think fascism always pushes for an ideal of the citizen as a microcosm of the state. And so the citizen is supposed to embody certain virtues that the state also embodies. But what those virtues are specifically is up to the specific fascist movement or government to decide on.
So I have a huge problem with that sort of mentality. It seems like whenever you're trying to whittle down like people into like this perfect form, it just leads to, well, I mean, I don't want to say it always leads to a lot of people getting killed, but like I guess it doesn't necessarily have to. It just seems to. I'm not entirely. It's just like there's a whole, I guess, slippery slope, but like typically that's a fallacy, but it's kind of true in this case, right? When you start picking out features, they are like, okay, the ideal citizen, like you could start with, can't speak out against the government, and then you can go to, like less extreme thought, like the ideal citizen can't think about like masturbating or something like that. I don't know, so it's some weird shit. And then you can start looking at characteristics, like the blonde hair, blue eyes, sort of things, and you start whittling people down in that way. And it seems like, I mean, if you are striving for that ideal citizen, it seems like it almost requires some process to remove the ones that you don't want, right? And so that thought process always seems like it will lead down a bad road.
Yes, and you're very right about that. And that is the dark mirror of the idea that I'm talking about. But if we were to kind of reinterpret that idea in a more flattering light or in a more generous light, we might say that a fascist movement would conceive of an ideal citizen and encourage a kind of virtue to flourish and flower among its citizenry while not punishing vice the way that fascist movements in the past have, or not punishing people being different the way that fascist movements in the past have, and even embracing a kind of diversity. But because diversity doesn't necessarily conflict with virtue. But it's really virtue, I think, that I would like to stress. If we were to bring any kind of element of fascistic thought back into the 21st century, a recontextualization, a reanalysis of that idea of the model citizen in fascism as being about basically doing good things, having a sense of duty, and caring about the people around you, and having strength and a spirit of self-sacrifice. I think that those are great, wholesome values that pretty much are universally accepted and lauded.
Okay, well, how about this then? Because I think almost by definition, like you end up having to whittle down diversity. Yeah, that like there's an exclusion of diversity in that thought process. Like almost once again by definition. But like let's say okay, so you mentioned duty a few times. So let's say however you ended up defining it. What would you do with people that didn't exemplify that virtue? That didn't that weren't they weren't hitting that standard. What would you do with those people? Or what would you suggest?
I don't think that there's much. Yeah, I don't think there's much you can do with them other than encourage them. Obviously, a more unscrupulous regime might have various nefarious plans for what to do with the subversives and the deviants, but that's definitely not the kind of government that I would want to live under. And I think that it would be very, it would be against our best interests to have that kind of authoritarianism that is very oppressive and socially restrictive. So I think it's more about encouragement. It's more about setting an example to follow. And I do think, this is one area where I disagree with fascism. Fascism tends to not really value critical thinking in the individual. That's something that I would change. I think that my ideal revisionist fascist nation would, it's silly to even talk this way, but my ideal nation and national zeitgeist would promote a spirit of critical thinking and a spirit of independence of thought. So yeah, that is definitely an area where I have a lot of difference with the classical ideal of fascism.
Well, I would argue that what you described when it comes to the ideal citizen, we already do that to an extent, right? In America, we already push for someone that's very patriotic, that's very hardworking, that's brave, that takes care of their family and their loved ones. But we never force that on people, right? And I would say that the same thing when it comes to the other traits of fascism we've talked about, the other virtues that you've brought up, like when it comes to being able to act quickly with the government, we already have that to an extent, but in a way that's not oppressive to the people. I guess, okay, so let me lay out America and kind of relay out my points when it comes to fascism versus what we already have. So when it comes to being able to control capitalism, the markets, once again, we already do that to a large extent. I don't think there's any capitalist society that has unregulated markets, right? It's kind of a requirement of capitalism. So you don't really need fascism when it comes to control over the markets for the good of the people. When it comes to quick action, once again, quick action can be good, but if you have a lot of it in a very short amount of time, going from left to right, if there's no consistency there, it can be devastating for society. But it's also so that's why I would say I would advocate for a more slower process like we have when it comes to Congress and the checks and balances. But once again, it's good to have that fast action in our back pocket, and that's why we have. That's one of the big reasons why we have the president. And then when it comes to the ideal citizen, once again, I feel like we already try to push those virtues without forcing them, and I feel like most fascist societies end up forcing them. I feel like we've already accomplished a lot of the things that you're wanting to accomplish through fascism without the fascism. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think where I'm at is I look at this issue more philosophically, and I look at the philosophy of the people living in my country, and I see a lot of things that I think can be improved on. I specifically am talking about the conservatives, who I have a lot of distaste for, in the way that they think about the government, in that they just hate taxation. They never want to be taxed. They never want the government to infringe on their liberty to do what they want with their businesses. And they want to keep their guns no matter what. And they all have this skepticism towards science, skepticism toward who they call the elites. It seems like they just want to dumb everything down to the lowest common denominator, not listen to anyone with any kind of expertise. And I just look at that situation and think, perhaps we need more elitism. Perhaps we need more of a respect for the institution of government. Perhaps we need more of a collective spirit. And so I look at what fascism was trying to accomplish, and I see those goals as quite noble. And maybe on a practical level, you could say that, well, what do we not already have now that fascism can provide? And maybe that's not an easy question for me to answer, because I think I'm taking more of a broad cultural look at this and thinking about the values that we have and how counterproductive they feel to me.
So to touch on the conservative thing a little bit, I would agree that a lot of the values they push, well, I'm very liberal, so I would disagree with a lot of it. But it's kind of, we almost have like a natural balance between the parties, right? Because it's good to be given to society, but only to an extent. And so I would say, like, in that example, in that case, Democrats kind of exemplify that sort of, like, it's good to, like, be a little bit more collective, help each other out a little bit more. And then the conservatives are kind of like the counterpole there, so we don't go too far. And I would say that you could say that for a lot of things going down that path, because everything's good in moderation, right? Like, I guess that's more or less what I'm trying to say. Even though I feel like the Conservative Party has gone a little bit wild when it comes to, like, science denial and stuff like that, like denying climate change. At this point, I'm not entirely sure how you would even do that. You would have to just completely distrust science as a whole. But yeah, so there are definitely some problems there, and it's not completely even. I would like to iron out those spaces where it's not. But yeah, once again, I would say, like, with the other things, there is, like, somewhat of a solution in the system we have currently. There's once again a counterbalance, or, like, both sides are pulling in the opposite direction, and it kind of leaves us in this, like, middle ground, right?
Yeah, I'm not so sure that I think the balance we have is a balance that I like. I think we can talk about the conservatives being there as a counterbalance. And I think it's good to have some sort of intellectual counterbalance to the idea of collectivism and all that. But I think really what they're doing is pulling the country in an unproductive direction. And so I don't really see the pitfalls of the collectivist vision as much as I see the pitfalls of the conservative direction as it exists now in America. And so to me, maybe I just have, rose-tinted glasses about this because the grass is greener on the other side. But I'm itching for some change. I'm itching for something else, something better than what we're currently dealing with.
I am not at all. The Trump stuff actually scares the crap out of me. I was so glad when Biden somehow managed to unseat him, because Jesus Christ, moderates, boring ass old men moderates are just so great compared to whatever the fuck Trump is. But so you said, okay, so you can see the pitfalls of like a conservative way, an individualistic way of thinking more than you can a collectivist one. Well, like, once again, like, I think there's a fundamental issue with being, like, wholly collectivist, like we talked about earlier on. There's almost no point at that point for, like, a citizen, an individual, to, like, agree to that contract. Yeah, like, do you know what I mean? Like, because if literally their entire existence is served for something other than them, then, like, once again, I wouldn't want to have anything to do with that system. I want to be able to focus on what's good for me as well. Well, probably more so. And I feel like as long as people are made to help to a certain extent, but then can focus on like benefiting themselves, I feel like overall that's the best sort of balance to strike when it comes to creating a nice, healthy society. So like over collectivization, I do think leads to issues. Like when it comes, well, I mean, individual liberty, which I guess, God, there's a problem with that because you said you don't necessarily value that in and of itself. Once again, if people aren't able to work in their own best interest, I just think like there's just no benefit at that point for that individual to be in that society. I think that's the main issue with that sort of thought. But
yeah, I can see that. I think that if everyone put the interests of other people before themselves, I think we would find that the society we're living in is much more pleasant to live in than the one we currently live in, where people are much more self-interested.
But that's not exactly what we're talking about, right? We're not talking about people benefiting other people or helping out other people. We're talking about people like giving themselves entirely to their nation, right?
Right.
Well, there's a difference in my mind there. Like,
so where would you say yeah, explain that.
So I would say, obviously, it's good to be like, good to your neighbors and whatnot. Well, like, oh God, okay. So difference between focusing more on the good of everyone else versus the good of the nation. Well, I would say, I guess maybe the good of the government is more or less what I'm talking about, or what their interests are. Mm-hmm. It seems like that's more of the focus of like a fascist nation when it comes to the individual, because like things can get really we've seen fascist nations get pretty bad. Like the majority of people in fascist nations didn't seem to be prospering for sure. So it seems like whatever they were helping was something other than everybody else. It seemed to be like the nation, right? I can see how
that's definitely a valid criticism.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it all kind of depends on the prerogatives of the specific government. If you have a good government, then obviously it would be in all of our best interest to serve that government. But if we have a bad government, then obviously it wouldn't. And so there are definitely problems inherent in the idea of a political ideology that puts service to the government first and foremost. And perhaps that's why I would prefer to kind of recontextualize the collectivist ideal of fascism as the government exists to kind of give life and give space to the nation, but the collectivist spirit of the citizen should not be focused on the government as some sort of abstract authority figure, but it should be focused on the community around us and how we can benefit the community in doing good things. And so, yeah, you're probably right in that fascism historically has placed too much emphasis on this sort of idea of obedience to authority. And actually, obedience, like the fascist motto, I don't like the fascist motto, credere, obbedire, combattere, which is believe, obey, fight. The obey part is the part that I take special issue with. And I don't think it's a great virtue to just be in blind obedience to whatever some authority says. And so I think we're mostly on the same page about this.
Well, in that case, yeah, it sounds like you might be like, I feel like you can find everything you're talking about within like a republic, or a sort of setup that we like, maybe something a little bit different, but like everything you've brought up, we exhibit it in one form or another in our society, like as it stands. I'm not sure if like we necessarily need fascism to push for those things, or if you want more of those things. Once again, I don't think we need to like completely overhaul the system to get there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get what you mean. And I think there are probably adjustments that we can make to get us more toward a kind of society that I would like. But I definitely think that you're wise to have a moderate view on this. I think you're wise to not want to just full steam ahead into some radical revision of the government system. And I think that definitely I don't like the idea of autocratic government or government or one party control. And so I think we're more or less in agreement here, but I think where I'm coming from is more like I said about the values and the way that we as individuals understand our relationship to the government and relationship to society. I think on a personal level, if I could do some good in affecting a change of thought in that way, then I will be satisfied.
Well, so the autocratic part that you brought up, it kind of that's a great example of what I'm talking. I feel like maybe you're wanting something other than fascism, because it seems like fascism is like, it's not like, I'm pretty, like I said at the beginning of this, I feel like dictatorship is almost like a fundamental aspect, like one party, one ruler sort of like mentality. That's like an aspect of fascism. So I don't know if you can have fascism without the autocracy or that authoritarian like dictatorship. So like, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it depends, because one of the kind of eye-opening things I discovered in my research was that British fascism, as proposed by the BUF, the British Union of Fascists, did not reject democracy, and they wanted to have a democratically elected parliament that had power over the government, that could check the power of the government. But they also wanted a more streamlined type of government where elected ministers could act a lot more quickly and a lot more decisively. And so I think that there's a balance that can be struck. And the fascist mentality is not necessarily, it's skeptical of democracy, but it's not necessarily anti-democratic. It's not necessarily autocratic. There are different ways to conceive a radical revision of society.
I suppose that's potentially true. I'm not, there's not even like, I know there's not even like a hard and fast like definition of what fascism is. So that's a tricky thing to argue. It just seems like that's one of the things that you kind of have to man, but I'm not, I need to do more research when it comes to fascism in order to like truly be like ready for a conversation like this. But overall, I would argue, just to kind of like, I guess, cap this part of the conversation off, I would argue that everything you're looking for can be found in society as it stands. And I think fascism tends to have it brings a lot of baggage with it that it just ends up like getting in the way of society as a whole. That would be, I guess, my final argument when it comes to, But anyways.
Yeah, that's totally fair. Yeah. I really loved having this conversation. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut it off right now because it's time for me to go to work. But I really like talking to you. It was a great time.
Yeah, no, it's
so
interesting.
have a good day.
Yeah, you too. See you later.
All right.
Oh, I'm sorry. I already hung up on you. Okay, well, that was you can't even see that. Okay. Thank you everybody for watching. That was fucking Forever Dirt. Really interesting guy. I'm not sure how I feel about the fascism thing. I want to look more into fascism. If I'm going to talk to this guy again. But overall, that was an interesting conversation. I enjoyed it. But anyways, thanks for watching, guys. And I love you.